Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm going to talk about the prologue, the opening of The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, because I think this is going to be a way to look at how Rothfuss writes. People always talk about how good Rothfuss's prose is, so I actually want to have a look at it to break apart some of the things that he is doing in his writing. And admittedly, just looking at the prologue doesn't give you a full insight into everything that he does, but I think it's a start and it's a manageable chunk. So let's have a look at this. So the prologue itself is called A Silence of Three Parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of three parts. So these opening two sentences, one of the things that I want to bring up here, it's called a silence of three parts. We have the repetition of that phrase, a silence of three parts. The opening is two sentences, and you go, oh, well, how does that connect? But it's two sentences broken into three clauses. So there's three parts. But more than that, more than anything else, look at that very, very first sentence. It was night again. Now I think of the difference of how that sentence sounds, what it actually means if you get rid of the word again. It was night. It was night is just boring. It's just descriptive. It's just telling you it's nighttime. But it was night again. The inclusion of the word again makes it into a much more interesting sentence. And yet it doesn't seem to change anything. It doesn't do anything to the sentence. But it was night again. And you just get this feeling of a continuing world, of something happening, that this world exists, all through the inclusion of one word. And something like that, you just go, is actually quite nice. It's a really clever little tiny technique, and it works really well. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of three parts. And this is something that is slightly difficult to unpack. So the idea that Rothfuss is promoting here is that silence is like music. Silence is like sound. That the silence itself is made up of different things. So if you think in music, you have a bass line, a treble line, and how it's combined, that there are these different parts coming together to make up the sound. But silence is just the absence of sound. So how can the absence of sound have three parts? So you have this wonderful inversion of what sound is, of what silence is. He's playing with the concept of silence. And that, I think, echoes so well through this. And he even starts using a lot of sound-based language. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet made by things that were lacking. So again, remember I had said about the breaking into three parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, one, echoing quiet, two, made by things that were lacking, three. So structurally, we see this repetition of three. So it's a very subtle thing, very easy to gloss over. But again, breaking it into three parts because it's tying in structurally into the thing that is being described. So then let's look at the actual content. It was hollow, echoing quiet. An echo is, of course, a sound. It reverberates. It's a repetition of sound. But here it's a repetition of silence. So again, the subversion or inversion, deconstruction of what a silence is. Now, we could talk about the fact that like a hollow echoing noise, that seems very trite. But because it's being combined with silence, it actually makes it slightly more interesting. But even then, it starts with the most obvious part. So when you walk in, you go, oh, the room's very silent. It's a very obvious silence. It's silent. I can't hear anything, therefore it's silent. It's very obvious that it's silent. It establishes all of these things. And it says that this is made by things that were lacking. So it's not talking about again, the absence of sound. It's saying that because these things are lacking, that creates a silence. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. Again, three clauses, three examples. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. So we have, starting with trees, moving towards the inn and the road. So we have a movement of the camera. We have a movement of perspective. It's not just, oh, there's these three random things. There's actual movement and sweeping of what we are looking at to try and find out what this silence is. And remember, it's describing a wind that would have sighed. So we know that the wind is lacking. It's still. But instead of saying it was a still night, there was no wind, we have it described in this way. So it feels far more active. It feels more engaging, even though it essentially is saying there was no wind. It would have basically set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, but it's not. The inn sign isn't creaking on its hooks. So what we have is the construction of, these are the sounds that you should be hearing, but they're missing here. So there's something perhaps slightly ominous being created. It is unnaturally still. Brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. So when you think of that wonderful noise of autumn leaves skittering and brushing and moving, that rustling noise of the leaves, you get that very sonorous quality to this description. But again, it's about its absence. It's not there. It's not the thing that you have in the background that you can always hear. If there had been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with conversation and laughter, the clatter and clamour one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. And again, so we have, when you go into an inn, you expect that hustle and bustle of people in the inn, that sort of the murmuring and the different conversations going on, and it builds up into a general sort of low-level hubbub that covers over everything. But that is missing, because there is no crowd. There isn't a handful of men inside the inn. And they aren't filling the silence. The silence is this big, empty, cavernous lack that is existing. But one of the things that I like here, so if there had been a crowd, 1, if there had been a handful of men, 2, they would have filled the silence, 3. But it's conversation and laughter, clatter and clamour. And you have that nice pairing of examples to give that sense of movement, the stressed and unstressed syllables in the sentence. It gives it a structure and a feel to the language. But even then, it's the clamour one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. So it's, when we think of all of these fantasy cliches or these fantasy images and stereotypes, it's the hustle and bustle of the inn with its roaring fire, and yeah, there might be shadows, but there's a warm glow about the place, the last homely inn. But this is emphasizing darkness and silence and lack. And that is all being built up in this paragraph. If there had been music, and here there's the insertion of an ellipsis, and then, but no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, and so the silence remained. So there's the third part. We had the wind being the first part, the crowd being the second part, the music being the third part, but none of these things exist. That is why there is silence. So again, the repetition of this sort of rule of 3 that Rothfuss is employing. But here, instead of doing the breakdown of all of the examples the way that he did for the wind and the people, the crowd, when it comes to the music, if there had been music, But no, there isn't. It so it immediately cuts it off. You get this sudden, abrupt silence now added in, where the wind was slowly blowing along and moving along. Then we had that sort of fixed in place, the idea of people inside, so a static, and then music. It gets cut off. So there's actually a transition in how these types of silences are being created. And again, it's creating subtle movement in the prose to create a dynamic movement within the text that wouldn't otherwise exist, because we could just summarize this. There was no wind. No one was in the inn. It was empty. There was no music. It was silent. You, you could tell someone all of these things and get across the information very, very quickly. But that lacks the immersion. It lacks the beauty and the poetry of the language. It makes it far less interesting. It makes it less immersive. If you just wanted the superficial, oh, it was quiet, silent, you go, why spend all of these words, this entire paragraph doing this? And you go, because this paragraph establishes not only the silence, not only the information that you need to know, but it's doing it in a very beautiful way. It's doing it in a very clever way. And it's doing it in a way that is suggesting a whole lot of things that should be there, but that are missing. So it's actually emphasizing lack. It is emphasizing darkness. It is emphasizing an abruptness and the end of sound. And it is emphasizing that it is nighttime. It is emphasizing all of these things. This silence is oppressive, and it is about something that is missing. Inside the Waystone, a pair of men huddled at one corner of the bar. Now, people sitting at a bar, huddling at a bar, this is not, it's not necessarily cliched, but it's certainly not an innovative way to describe two people sitting there, particularly when it's combined with the next line. They drank with quiet determination, avoiding serious discussions of troubling news. Drinking with quiet determination is a well-established sort of, not quite cliche, but it's a well-used, well-worn phrase. But because it's been added in here, it is something that is recognizable. It is something that puts the reader at ease. And also, one of the reasons why this phrase gets used quite a lot is it is so descriptive. You can very vividly imagine two people that are just, they're there to drink, and they're not being raucous about it. It's not a celebration. It's just the quiet, I'm drinking to get through something. So this isn't a celebration. Again, so tying into that tone, tying into that atmosphere that is being created. And they were avoiding serious discussions of troubling news. So even though they're not talking about troubling news, there's the suggestion of troubling news. But all of this, they are huddled, quiet, and avoiding discussion. Again, emphasizing lack, emphasizing emptiness, emphasizing the silence. In doing this, they added a small, sullen silence to the larger, hollow one. It made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. So this is the second silence. We've moved from the first one, which is this big emptiness. And now there's a small sullen, that there's an emotion tied. The first one, it's just lack of sound. But now there's a sullen silence, that there's an atmosphere, there's a feeling, there's an emotion running through this silence. And again, we're so used to emotion and tone and all of these things being associated with sound, being associated with music. But here, Rothfuss is applying all of those techniques, all of that conceit to silence, and saying this silence is made up of other bits of silence, and they are distinct silences. You just think about that for a moment, that this is just such a wonderful way of trying to construct it. And then it made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. So the counterpoint obviously can tie into this idea of music and having a melody and a counter melody, or that aspect of how music is constructed. But I really like the phrase, it made an alloy of sorts, because with alloy, you're getting a sense of that metallic, of cold, um, not organic, inorganic, artificial, man-made. And this silence is man-made. The first silence was about a lack, and it started with the wind and started with all the things you would naturally expect to find. And now we have a man-made silence. So we've moved from the natural to the man-made. Now we get to the third silence. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. As if, right, you can notice the really obvious one, it's just quiet. Oh, well, I've noticed that. And then the harder one to notice was, well, there's actually another part to this quiet, which is those people over there being sullenly quiet. And now we're being told, but now there's a third silence, and this one's hard to notice. But again, it's not saying the third silence was hard to notice. It says it's not an easy thing to notice. So framing it in the negative, which again ties into what Rothfuss has been doing in the other paragraphs. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wooden floor underfoot and in the rough, splintering barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the black stone hearth that held the heat of a long dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth rubbing along the grain of the bar. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. Now let's unpack some of this stuff. If you listened for an hour, you might be able to figure out part of this silence. So this is a silence that goes on for a long time because it's lasting more than an hour. But what are the things that are being picked up here? You can feel this silence in the floor and in the barrels and in the weight. This silence has substance. Where the first silence was about lack, the second silence was about an emotion, this third silence has a weight to it. It has an importance to it. It is a physical feeling and silence. The black stone hearth, splintering barrels, rough. The long dead fire. Look at the language that's being repeated here. Look at how these choices give you a sense of something ominous, something dark, something tension filled. These are not happy things. So in the previous paragraph, we had sullen, we had this lack, and it's at night again. But now we're getting a doubling down and an increase in these descriptors to give us those elements. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth. Now, we could say, so the long dead fire, but it held the heat of a long dead fire. But if the fire's long dead, you get a sense that the heat it's holding, it's not actually a lot. There's no heat, it's cool. The white linen cloth then, and we're talking about the white linen on wood. Now, I admit what I'm about to say is a bit of a stretch, but this is slightly funereal. This is like a wake. This is like someone has died because the fire has died. It's night again. People are sullen and quiet. There is a lack. There's a lack of life. There's a lack of emotion. Everything is sort of funereal, awake, the end of a life. And the white linen, the cloth, the shroud over the wood. So yes, is that a stretch? Because it's a guy polishing the bar top. That's what's being described. But what I'm suggesting is there is this connotation, there is this subtext running through it because of the lack, because of the sullenness, because of the oppressive nature of this silence, and because of these dark descriptors that are running through. that there is a suggestion of funereal. And I think it actually is not an overreach to suggest that. But the white linen cloth rubbing along the grain of the bar. And if you think, even that should have a small brushing noise, but here it's being described as a silence. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. So we've moved from outside the bar. We've moved from the wind blowing around, the leaves, the sign coming up to the bar. We've moved into the bar and the people sitting in the bar, the patrons sitting there on the corner of the bar. And now we've moved even closer and we're with the barman, the bartender, who is polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in lamplight. And now we have light coming in. This moment of light gleamed in the lamplight is coming in at the end of this sentence. It's associated with the barman, where everything else is dark and everything else is sullen and everything else is lack. He may be part of this silence, but he is somewhat different. And that's being emphasized there just at the end. The man had true red hair, red as flame. To be perfectly honest, I'm not overly fond of this sentence. True red hair. So he had red hair, but it was really red. It was red, and it was red as flame. I don't know. I can visualize it. I get what's going on. I just this lacks a lot of the poetry that the other lines had, but you can very clearly visualize it as someone who has like a deep red hair rather than slightly ginger or slightly orange or dirty blonde or whatever other descriptor people are going to use. True red, like really red, red as flame. And so we've moved from the stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight to now saying that this character's hair is like flame. And then his eyes were dark and distant. Now, again, that can sound very, very cliched. But when it's contrasted, his hair was like flame, but his eyes are dark. You're getting that natural contrast between the two things. And that's what elevates it beyond the cliche that it usually is of, oh, his eyes were dark and distant. But again, think of that dark and distant as it has such a nice sound to it, like the clatter and clamor that we had earlier. And he moved with the subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. And now we're kind of moving into strange abstract notions. A subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. Because I know many things, I move differently than if I didn't know many things. But what we do here, what we're getting here, is that he has a certainty, a confidence. His movements are very deliberate, and that he is the repository of strange arcane knowledge. He knows many things. So it's not just about always tell the reader what's going on. Sometimes it's about showing the reader these things, expressing these things, and letting you feel it out, feel what is going on, rather than, oh, it was deliberately told to me and I know exactly what the facts are, and moving on. This is about creating a feeling to the text, not necessarily about the most efficient way to tell you what is happening. And then we get to the last paragraph. The waystone was his. So we know the waystone inn, and then it was referred to as the waystone. So the waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. So to stop here, I didn't talk about waystone, the idea that the waystone inn, a journey point, a point of movement on a journey, the marker that is being used, a waystone. This is one point along a longer journey. And we're told the waystone was his. Not the waystone inn was his, although that's what it's implying. But this is a point along the journey, and it's his journey. Just as the third silence was his. So he owns the silence. He owns the bar. He owns the silence. He is the source of light because of his red hair that we have in the bar. Everything is being brought down to this barman, to this person, emphasizing how important he is. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the three, wrapping the others inside itself. Now just think about that for a moment. The first silence, when it was talking about the lack of wind, that's outside. When it was talking about the fact that the sign wasn't creaking in the wind, that is outside. When it was talking about the leaves weren't rustling along the ground, that was outside. And yet his silence is so big, so powerful, so all-encompassing, that it's not just in the bar and around him. It's not just the whole interior of the bar. It's not just the bar itself. It's actually encompassing this entire scene. Everything is about this character, the power of this character, the importance of this character. And when we think about it, there's lack, there's emotion, but with him, it is a physical feeling of silence. That there's some substance to this silence, which implies there is a reason for his silence. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river-smooth stone. It was the patient cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. And now we see that Rothfuss again returns to that rule of three. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy. So we have deep, wide, heavy, and patient. It's waiting. And you get a sense of the power, the enormous immensity of this silence, of this portentous, ominous, and all of that build-up, we get into the very last words, sound of a man who is waiting to die. And that's the clincher, the end point of this prologue, that's what it's ending on. It's ending on such an ominous note. Now, there are a couple of things I want to talk about in these descriptors. So deep and wide as autumn's ending. What does that even mean? It's not clear. It's abstract and poetic. Deep and wide as autumn's ending. How is autumn's ending deep and wide? But it doesn't have to make pure logical sense. It has an abstract notion to it. And we have the same with, it was heavy as a great river smooth stone. That one is much easier to picture. We've all seen those pebbles and stones in a river that have been worn smooth by the water. But this isn't talking about a simple pebble. It's talking about a stone. So you get, again, a sense of size, but of time passing. So with autumn's ending, time passing. What happens at the end of autumn? We move into winter, the death of the seasons. Heavy as the great river smooth stone. Time passes like a river. It's flowing. It won't end, and it wears everything away. It's about erosion. It's about the reduction. It's about destruction. It was the patient cut flower sound. What is a cut flower sound? But a cut flower, remember I'd said about the funereal sort of sound that was coming through? The flowers on the grave, you cut flowers off. These are dead flowers. They have been cut off in their life, in their prime. They are flowering and beautiful, but they have been cut, snipped, cut short, ended. And it's a sudden ending. But it's patient. The patient cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. So I just wanted to talk through some of those things that you can see Rothfuss employing structural aspects like the rule of three and keep coming back to that very subtly, using breaking sentences into three clauses, using three examples, but doing it subtly throughout, not calling attention to it all the time, only sometimes, because it does talk about the third silence, the different silences. But that shows you how he plays with structure and has paid attention to structure. And then the use of the movement of where the camera is and what it's focusing on, from outside all the way to the interior, all the way to the barman, that you have a consistent movement of view through these descriptions. And then the language being used, the inversion of what we are expecting a discussion of sound to be, because this is silence, the antithesis of sound, the lack of sound, but treating silence as if it was sound. So playing with that and creating these things, again, gives what could have been very cliched, very trite, very boring descriptions. Things that, oh, so there was an ominous silence, was it? Oh, I haven't heard that before. But because Rothfuss gave it that poetic notion and conceit of treating it as if it was a sound, it makes something so simple as it was quiet much more interesting, much more engaging. It adds an element of emotion and an element of atmosphere to what is going on. And ultimately, it ends on focusing on this barman, focusing on this character, and this sense that he is biding his time, waiting to die, that there is something going on here. So it ends on, wouldn't you like to read on and find out what's going to happen next? Who is this barman? What the hell is happening? What is going on? So it's doing exactly what a prologue should do. It's inviting you further in. But that's why I like this prologue. You can see all of these different things going on. And it is a lot of fun. You can see the beauty to the language being expressed. It's not just about economic concision and being as precise and as quick as possible to tell you all the information as possible. It's inviting you to feel these things, not just know that they are there. And that's why I like this. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.